Have you ever heard of a group of women in ancient Rome who were more respected, more powerful, and even more feared than some senators? They weren't empresses or warriors. They were the Vestal Virgins, the priestesses of Vesta, the Roman goddess of the hearth, home, and family. Their story is one of incredible privilege, immense responsibility, and terrifying consequences. So, who exactly were these women, and what did they do that made them so crucial to the Roman Empire? Let's travel back in time to the heart of ancient Rome. At the center of the Roman Forum stood a small round temple, the Temple of Vesta. Unlike other grand temples dedicated to gods like Jupiter or Mars, this one didn't house a statue of its deity. Instead, it contained something far more vital, the sacred fire of Rome, the Ignis. Vesta, this eternal flame, was the symbol of the city's life, its continuity, and its divine favor. As long as the fire burned, Rome would stand. If it went out, it was a sign of impending doom, a catastrophic omen that the gods had abandoned them. And whose job was it to keep this flame alive 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, for over 1,000 years? That monumental task fell to just 6 women, the Vestal Virgins. Their official title was Sacerdos Vestalis, or Priestess of Vesta. They were chosen as young girls, typically between the ages of 6 and 10, from patrician families, Rome's elite. The selection process itself was a solemn affair conducted by the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief high priest. He would select 20 eligible girls, and then one would be chosen by lot. The ceremony was described as a form of capture, where the priest would take the girl's hand and say, "I take you, Amata, to be a Vestal priestess." From that moment on, she was no longer considered part of her family. She belonged to the state, to the goddess Vesta. Once chosen, a Vestal Virgin embarked on a 30-year term of service. This was divided into 3 decades. For the first 10 years, she was a novice, learning the complex rituals, prayers, and duties from the older priestesses. The second decade was spent actively performing these duties, primarily tending the sacred fire, and in her final 10 years, she became a teacher, passing on her knowledge to the new novices. The most famous and perhaps most stringent rule for a Vestal was the vow of chastity. For her entire 30-year term, she had to remain a virgin. This wasn't just a moral guideline, it was a sacred obligation. Her purity was directly linked to the purity and well-being of Rome itself. The symbolism was powerful. Just as the fire was pure and eternal, so too must be its keepers. In exchange for this immense sacrifice, the Vestals were granted privileges that were unheard of for women in ancient Rome. They were the only women who were not under the legal authority of a male relative, a father, or a husband. They could own property, make a will, and testify in court. They had seats of honor at public games and theatrical performances. When they traveled through the city, they were escorted by a lictor, a guard who would clear the way. For them, a privilege usually reserved for the highest magistrates, anyone who injured a Vestal could be sentenced to death. Even a condemned criminal could be pardoned if they happened to cross paths with a Vestal on their way to execution. In a society where women were largely confined to the domestic sphere, the Vestals were public figures of immense status and independence. Their primary duty was, of course, tending the sacred flame in the temple of Vesta. This was a relentless, round-the-clock job. The fire could never ever go out. The Vestals worked in shifts to ensure it was always fed and watched over. If the flame was extinguished through negligence, the Vestal responsible was severely punished. She would be taken to a dark, secluded room and flogged by the Pontifex Maximus. This was considered a terrible omen, and elaborate purification rituals were required to appease the goddess and restore Rome's divine protection. But their job didn't stop there. They also guarded sacred objects stored within the temple, objects so secret that only the Vestals and the Pontifex Maximus were allowed to see them. They were responsible for preparing molus alsa, a special mixture of salt and toasted flour used in virtually every official state sacrifice. By preparing this essential ingredient, they were involved in almost all aspects of Roman public religion, connecting them to the spiritual life of the entire empire. They also performed rituals related to the home and family, reflecting Vesta's role as goddess of the hearth. Now, what about that vow of chastity? What happened if a Vestal broke it? The punishment was one of the most horrifying sentences in Roman law. While their bodies were sacred and could not be harmed directly, the Romans found a loophole. If a Vestal was found guilty of unchastity, she was considered to have polluted the state. The sentence was live burial. She would be dressed in funeral clothes, placed on a bier, and carried in a silent procession to a place called the Campus Celeratus, or the Evil Field. There an underground chamber had been prepared, furnished with a small couch, a lamp, and a meager portion of bread, water, milk, and oil. The Vestal would descend into the chamber, the entrance would be sealed, and the earth piled on top, leaving her to die in the darkness. Her male partner in the act was publicly flogged to death in the Forum. This brutal punishment served as a terrifying warning, reinforcing the idea that the Vestal's purity and the safety of Rome were inextricably linked. So what happened after their 30 years of service were complete? At around the age of 40, a Vestal was free to leave the priesthood. She was given a state pension and could, for the first time in her adult life, marry. It might sound like a happy ending, but historical sources suggest that few actually chose to do so. After a lifetime of unparalleled status, independence, and respect, returning to the conventional life of a Roman matron under the authority of a husband may have seemed like a step down. Many chose to remain within the College of Vestals, continuing to live in the Atrium Vesta, their grand residence next to the temple, and serving as respected elders and advisors. The Order of the Vestal Virgins was one of Rome's most enduring institutions, lasting for over 1,000 years. They were there from the early days of the Roman kingdom and continued through the Republic and the Empire. It was only in the late 4th century AD, when Christianity became the dominant religion, that the order was disbanded. The Christian Emperor Theodosius I extinguished the sacred flame for the final time in 394 AD, ending a tradition that had defined the spiritual heart of Rome for centuries. The story of the Vestal Virgins gives us a fascinating glimpse into the Roman world. It shows us a society that, while deeply patriarchal, could create a unique space for women to hold immense power and autonomy. They were guardians of Rome's soul, living symbols of its permanence. Their lives were a paradox of privilege and peril, of sacred duty and severe sacrifice. They were more than just priestesses. They were pillars of the Roman state, and their eternal flame lit the way for an empire. Thanks for watching. If you found this journey into ancient Rome interesting, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more stories from history. See you next time.